Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, senior editor at Forbes. The Catholic Church has chosen a new pope, and he is an American for the first time in history. Pope Leo XIV gave his first Mass over the weekend, and joining us to discuss his early days as pontiff is Massimo Faggioli. He is a professor of theology at Villanova University, which incidentally is the alma mater of the new pope. Massimo, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I want to start with the Villanova piece. How significant is that to you and to the university that you represent? Were you expecting a Villanova alum to be named Pope?
Well, it was not expected. It was a dream for sure. He was very popular here even before becoming cardinal. And so many Augustinians, I mean, all Augustinians on campus know him well. This means a lot for the whole university in general, for American Catholic universities, because he studied also at CTU in Chicago. It means something very special for me, for us in our department of theology, because we are called to hold a certain kind of standard in some sense, so that will attract more attention, I think. So last week was a week of celebration after his election. It was bells ringing for hours. So it's a new page, I think, for the university and for the Augustinians, especially who govern our university.
You mentioned Augustinian, and for folks who aren't familiar with Catholicism writ large, can you talk about the significance of this being an Augustinian pope versus Pope Francis, who had been Jesuit?
The Augustinians is an order founded on the charism, on the theology, on the text of St. Augustine, who's the major thinker for early or ancient Latin-speaking Western Christianity. And is foundational for so many issues, for the doctrine of sacraments, of the church, for doctrine of just war, all of that. So he's a thinker who writes at that crucial time of the collapse of the Roman Empire. And Augustine, who comes from Northern Africa, which was back then, I mean, part of the Roman Empire, he sees this empire collapse, and his question is, what should we do now? As Christians, as citizens, as human beings. And so that's why he has become so popular among some thinkers lately, especially in the Anglo-American world, because they think Augustine has a lot to say to the sense of crisis of the Western world. So this is different because if we compare Augustinian theology with Jesuit theology, so Jesuits are historically much more attracted by the margins, what Pope Francis called the peripheries, which means geographically much more attracted by Asia, by non-Christian religions, non-Christian cultures. So they have a more confident openness to what's new, to what's diverse, to the non-Christian cultures, traditions. So we will see how these two identities will compare, because we knew a lot about Pope Francis when he was elected, because he had written several important pieces of writings before becoming Pope. We don't have that for Pope Leo. And so there's no paper track or trail that we can follow. And so every day it's discovery, because there are no notable books or published writings of Robert Prevost that can help us understand as a background him as a thinker.
Oh, that's so interesting. Do you think that was intentional on the part of the conclave to pick someone who had less of a paper trail?
I don't think so. So what we have seen in these last few decades, So Pope Francis and John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Paul VI. So all these popes of these last 60 years, all of them, for some reasons, they had written a lot before becoming cardinals and before becoming pope. But that was a new thing because we didn't have necessarily that in the early 20th century, 20th century. So it might be a return to an older tradition where you do not have to be a published theologian, a published author to be elected pope. I think the choice of Prevost was very intentional, but not based on that reason. There's no formal vetting like in the White House when they have to hire someone. So he was known for some reasons as a cardinal in charge of a very important office in the Vatican, as a former superior of the Augustinians. So his reputation didn't need to be on Amazon with some published book.
Not on Amazon, but I do know some folks have been combing through past tweets and social media posts to try to figure out what has he said about Donald Trump, what has he said about J.D. Vance. What do you make of this social media analysis? And is it appropriate in this case, or is there really nothing we can glean from how he has tweeted in the past?
So first of all, it's appropriate because it's a public forum. So if you publish something, it should be unavailable, and it could be used to know more about you and so on. I mean, one big question for these figures is whether they are their own social media manager. We don't know that. Okay, so he's younger than his predecessors when they were elected. But I mean, we never had a pope this young in these last 40 years, right? So he, in some sense, he's much closer to what we call now digital natives, right? So it's possible that he was really saying these things himself, or that someone else was tweeting him this on his behalf and agreed with that, or that he might have used a different language. Now, I think that what he published in those tweets is really his thinking. So he's a social Catholic who, on the issue of immigration especially, is very much a representative of what most American bishops think on the responsibility of the government towards migrants and refugees. There are little differences between so-called conservative bishops and liberal bishops in the American episcopate on this. So having said that, so I think that when you are elected pope, there's something that changes. So what you say as a bishop, as a cardinal, is necessarily different from what you say as a pope. So we shouldn't expect him to repeat exactly what he said 2 months ago or 10 years ago. He might, but I mean, being pope entails a certain kind of responsibilities, and gives you a certain freedom to reshape your message. That is part of the papal office. That has happened before with the previous popes on some issues.
Now, you mentioned that the choice of Pope Leo was intentional for some reasons, not necessarily the paper trail. What do you think? I know it's impossible to fully know what the conclave was thinking, but what do you see as their intentions behind this choice specifically? Because I feel like we spoke in the past about how an American pope felt unlikely given what a global power America is. I think a lot of people were very surprised by the specific American choice here. But what do you see as the primary intentions behind this choice?
So the primary intention, I think, was to give some continuity to the overarching message of Pope Francis, without tying him to a specific agenda, right? But so this is a college of cardinals that has been shaped by Pope Francis with a very, very intentional policy of personnel. So that was the first thing. And I think it was clear also because with this position in the Vatican, he was in contact with many other cardinals, many other bishops in the world, that he was not an American pope, but a pope born in there in the States who was really profiting from his missionary experience in Latin America for 2 decades, and as a former superior of his order, he had a specific knowledge of the global Catholic Church. So that's something that's typical of the members of the religious orders, and so I think he was elected from. I mean, mostly thanks to a support of the cardinals from the Americas, Latin America, but also the United States, and some Spanish, Portuguese speaking bishops in Europe and in Northern Africa. So what emerged was that he had the perfect profile, the perfect. So it was not a matter of ideology or of fitting a certain checklist, but in the end, it is a choice on a person. That's why the vote is secret, okay? Because you vote on a person, and it's very delicate. But from what we know, it emerged very quickly that he was the strongest candidate, and all possible opponents to him very quickly realized that they needed to rally behind him, and so that's why we had a very quick conclave, the fourth ballot, second day. That has been surprising in some sense, but it says how strong his voice was, apparently also because of the speech he gave the day before the conclave opened, which made a strong impression.
He's made impressions in some of his early masses as Pope, and I'd love for you to share what has struck you as he has spoken to the public. He had Sunday Mass. There are some headlines about him meeting with journalists, which is not in a mass, but saying that he wants to pull back on divisive language. What do you make of his leadership in his first few days as pontiff?
It's very early, of course, but so we see that he mentioned explicitly his predecessors, Pope Francis, John Paul II, Paul the Sixth, explicitly or implicitly. So he's not a pope of rupture, but he understands very well the need of reassurance to the Catholic world that I'm walking in the footsteps of my predecessors. He mentioned Vatican II, the great event of the Catholic Church in these last 4 centuries. So when Vatican II opened, he was 7 years old. So that's really shocking because all of the popes already grown up or even members of the Second Vatican Council. He was 7. He mentioned synodality, so the idea of a church that has to be less clerical, that has to find new ways to discuss and govern. He's crafting his own message in a very good Italian, I can say, as an Italian. Uses English rarely. That's wise, I think. He has made already interesting things. So that speech to the journalist on Monday the 12th was really a defense of the freedom of the press. He warned against the use of divisive language in the press, and he was talking not just to the mainstream secular media, but also to Catholic media, I guess, which has fallen often into this temptation of using divisive language. It seems that he had the first phone call with the president of Ukraine in a very delicate situation internationally, because there seems to be a meeting in the next few days in Turkey. Pope Leo maybe will travel later in the spring because of the anniversary of the Council of Nicaea of 325. So he's been very active. He has chosen to live in the papal apartment again. He's not doing what Pope Francis decided. It's a return to a tradition. So it's a mix of old and new for the first 3-4 days of his pontificate.
A mix of old and new. I've seen some analysis around the choice of the name Leo. The theological history behind it has some really interesting context. I'd love for you to share what you see as the significance of the choice of Leo, and in theologic history, what Leo's relationship to Francis was.
So there are a few important popes named Leo in church history, but especially one is important, Leo the 13th, who had one of the longest pontificates, 25 years, between 1878 1903. He's especially important for American Catholics because he was the pope who published in 1891 the encyclical Rerum Novarum on the new things, which was addressing the Industrial Revolution. And so Pope Leo was rejecting, at the same time, very clearly, socialism, communism, and defending a market economy and so on. But at the same time, he was warning against the excesses of laissez-faire capitalism. So he really crafted the first foundations of the modern Catholic social doctrine vis-a-vis capitalism, the market economy, its impact on life, on the family. So he chose Leo the 13th for that, and he explained that in the speech he gave 2 days after his election, saying, "We are now seeing a new industrial revolution, and now I'm drawing inspiration from Pope Leo." And then there's another small thing which maybe is not that small for him. So Pope Leo the 13th was an active promoter of the Augustinians in his pontificate. And so there's a very strong relationship between Leo the 13th and the Augustinians, and I think it's something that Prevost knows very well. So other people have said it's Pope Leo the First. It might be Pope Leo the Third, who crowned Charlemagne in Rome in the year 800. Actually, the Pope himself told us it's Leo the 13th. So there's no question about what's most important for him.
He's made his values clear, but there are still a lot of questions. And one of the big questions that I've seen in some Catholic media, to your point about Catholic media slipping into perhaps divisive language, but I think it's a fair question. One of the big issues for the church is the ongoing handling of the abuse scandal. What was Robert Francis Prevost's record as cardinal in dealing with priests who had been accused of abuse? And what does his election as pope mean for how the Vatican writ large will continue to grapple with this issue?
So Prevost was bishop in Peru, which has a specific history of dealing with the abuse crisis. And against some cases in Peru, there's been a very decisive action by the Vatican. And so I think Prevost can show that as part of his record, because these actions were taken in this last year, so before he was elected Pope. Second, in the Vatican, he was the chief of this office that prepares the bishops' appointments. And so this is one of the most sensitive tasks, because you have to make sure that the bishops that are appointed or promoted have a good record on that. I think he gets this because he's an American. And so some other cultures, from Italy, for example, so there's less sensibility to that. I mean, he's coming from the United States. I think it's very, very fresh for him, this shock. So Pope Francis has done many things. It's always a work in progress. One open question is what to do with the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, which was created by Pope Francis, but always remained in something like a limbo in the Vatican, right? And so this is something that he might choose to restructure it, to put it in a different box in Roman Curia. Culturally, it's the most devastating, the most damaging thing of these last 40 years in the Catholic Church, and he knows this very well. I think so, but this is going to be evaluated with a stick, which is different from his predecessors. I think because he's younger, and he's from America, from the United States, and so the standard is a little higher for him, I think.
That makes sense. Well, there's a lot to be seen from Pope Leo XIV. And one of my final questions to you, I return to where we started, the fact that he is an American Pope. People here, Catholic and non-Catholic, seem very excited. Does this do anything for American Catholicism and the number of people going to church, or spirituality and faithfulness as a whole? Or is this a moment in time and then we'll return to stasis after?
We'll see, because we saw that there was a lot of enthusiasm, for example, for the Polish Pope in Poland. And then that effect didn't last for very long, right? On the other hand, when John Paul II visited Denver in 1993, 94, I'm not sure now, his impact was lasting in the Denver area, in the U.S. Catholic Church, right? So I think that Pope Leo will make a big impact on U.S. Catholicism at this time, especially when it seems that the secularization has slowed down a little, so that the United States will become more secular than it used to be, but not as secular as Europe, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So he has an opportunity. He, as an American, he doesn't need translators, interpreters, mediators to talk with the American bishops or with American politicians. He knows them, he gets them, and he cannot be accused of being a communist or an anti-American. It would be ludicrous, right? And so this is really, it could be transformative for the Vatican, for a certain culture of management in the Vatican and so on, but especially for the United States. This is really, I mean, I've seen a lot of excitement on campus here, in my parish, on the media. It's something that we didn't think was possible until a few weeks ago, and now it is, and it will be much more difficult for American Catholics to ignore him or to dismiss him or to say, well, he doesn't understand us. It's a very tough sell right now.
I lied. That was my penultimate question. My final question to you is, we had talked a few weeks ago about the number of global crises that the new pope would walk into, and you referenced the war between Russia and Ukraine as one of them just a few minutes ago. What is the likelihood that the appointment of a new pope meaningfully moves the needle on any one of these crises? Does the infusion of a new leader perhaps change the tenor of the war in Ukraine or any of the humanitarian crises that we're seeing in Gaza or anywhere else around the world? Do we have more hope for a solution anywhere?
It's possible for two reasons. First, because especially on Ukraine, that was one of the most controversial positions taken by Pope Francis. And so it's possible that Pope Leo will adopt a different language, a different tone. Also because, I mean, Leo is an Augustinian. Augustine has a very fundamental doctrine on just war, which is something on which Francis was not so keen, okay? And the second thing is that having a pope who's from America, from the United States, at the helm of the Catholic Church, changes a lot of things in the way the Chinese government will look at the Vatican, the Russian government will look at the Vatican, the Indian government will look at it. So, I mean, having a pope from the US is really a new set of cards in the same game, okay, but it is a set of... So now the problem is that there are incredibly high expectations of Pope Leo that he will solve the problems of America, of Europe, of the environment. That's going to be difficult to address all that, but he is the most energetic pope we have seen in 40 years. I mean, he's very youthful. He looks very energetic, looks very young. He reminds us, I mean, incredibly, of the series by Sorrentino, The Young Pope. I mean, a pope from America. So there are two different things. Okay, let me be clear. Okay, but in terms of energy, of what he's bringing that's new, it reminds me of that series, which was prophetic in its own way, maybe.
Massimo Faggioli, professor of theology at Villanova, thank you so much for joining us to tell us about Pope Leo XIV's earliest days as pontiff and what we can perhaps expect from him as pope going forward. We so appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you. My pleasure.